Welcome to the GTAP Virtual Seminar Series. My name is Zeynep Akgül. I'm the GTAP University Coordinator at the Center. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Professor Edward Balistreri. Professor Balistreri joined the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in August 2020, and he serves as the Duane Ackley College of Business Uter Institute Chair. And in his role, he is a professor in the Department of Economics and also a core faculty member at the Clayton and Uter Institute of International Trade and Finance. So what makes Ed's work so compelling is the unique and informed perspective that he brings, both as an educator and a researcher, from his experience across academia, government, and also consulting. And he has contributed to critical climate and trade policy disputes and debates as a professor at institutions including Iowa State University and the Colorado School of Mines, as well as a research economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. So this blend of experience gives him deep expertise in the practical analysis of trade agreements and trade disputes. He has worked extensively with legal teams on issues surrounding agricultural and energy products, as well as the composition of impacts of policies across U.S. states. Ed earned his PhD and master's degrees in economics from the University of Colorado Boulder, and his bachelor's degree from Arizona State University. He's also a 2024-2027 research fellow at the GTAP Center. Ed and his co-authors have been working on new trade theories for many years, and they have contributed to several ways in this literature by providing tools to compare these alternative trade structures in quantitative models of trade policy analysis. So their work spans from mathematics of generalized versions of Armington, Krugman, and Melitz models to structural estimation of these models to welfare responses of these models to applications to carbon policy and climate change issues, to just name a few. So today's seminar is titled Quantifying Disruptive Trade Policies, and this is a recent publication in the Journal of Global Economic Analysis by Edward Balistreri, Christoph Boehringer, and Thomas Rutherford. So in this work, they contribute both methodologically and applied to the field of CG and quantitative trade policy analysis. So while much of the theoretical literature after Krugman and Melitz has advanced our understanding of how firm heterogeneity and level variety matters, a large-scale full implementation in the CG and quantitative trade literature remains limited due to computational complexities. And their work bridges this gap by proposing an alternative computationally tractable structure and also capturing the key behavioral mechanisms in these modern trade theories. And their study also showcases this by one of the most important discussions in trade literature and also in recent economic history, the impact of tariffs and disruptive trade policies. So we're thrilled to have Ed today to share his research and insights with us. And before I leave the floor to him, I'd like to make the usual reminders. So we have a 25-minute presentation followed by a 25-minute Q&A session, a discussion session. So we will be monitoring the chat for questions. So please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A session to ask them in person. So this seminar is being recorded, and the recording and our presentation slides will be made available on the website and on our social media. Finally, please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. And without further ado, I'd like to leave the floor to Ed. Ed, over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and happy to be here this morning. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this recent publication. And let me share my screen here. All right, hopefully everybody can see my slides now.
Yes, it's good.
All right, so I'll give you a little bit of background on this paper. Paper sat around for quite a while. Really, Tom and Chris started working with the British government, Treasury, HMT, around the time of the Brexit debate. And we developed this sort of innovative model that builds on the work that Tom and I and David Tarr and others had been doing. And so it's sort of a unique structure. You know, we had been doing a lot of work on the mellet stuff. And this model, the model for HMT, actually included FDI and some other features that were not really clean for the experiment that we wanted to do in this paper. But that sort of gives you some origin. And so really the first version of this paper came out in 2018, and it was really only the persistence of Christoph that sort of pushed us forward. And about a year and a half ago, we went ahead and pushed this forward to publication. So I'm really happy to have it in the literature, and it helps me out because it gives me something to cite on a lot of other stuff. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. Not necessarily for the paper, but more for the theory and where we're coming from. I have a few slides with a lot of equations to talk about the trade theories, but I'm going to argue that the model in its, the theory sort of simplifies in a way that makes it really tractable in a general equilibrium setting. So we don't really add much complexity beyond a standard Armington model. I'm going to talk about some I'll talk just briefly about sort of the overall scope of the CGE model and talk about some results. This is a place where there's going to be a little bit of bait and switch, where I'm going to be giving you some new results, more results on Trump 2.0 than 2.1, which was the focus of the paper. And then I'll offer a few concluding remarks. So again, you know, it's sort of a surprise for trade economists. We were working on trade sort of on the margins for a long time, and these new nationalist policy political movements really pushed us to start going back after traditional sort of tariff analysis. And so we know that there are these sort of disruptive political movements where trade is not viewed sort of from the economic perspective, which was really the tradition after World War II, was that economists were really effective in shaping trade policy, and in particular, sort of the idea of the WTO and cooperative trade agreements where you get yourself out of this prisoner's dilemma of optimal tariffs. I really am going to argue that optimal tariffs are not really on the radar screen. Other than as rhetorical points. If you look at the tariffs that are being proposed by the imposed and proposed by the current administration, they generally have no interest in a traditional economic perspective of manipulating the terms of trade in favor of the imposing country. So they're more traditional mercantilist perspectives on tariffs. Okay, so we generally think that these tariffs are not very effective in achieving domestic policy goals, and that's because tariffs naturally have a dual distortion on the production side and the consumption side. And if you have a domestic policy goal, let's say you want to achieve a certain amount of steel production, you can always achieve that with a straightforward sort of domestic policy on subsidizing steel that doesn't cause the price of steel grain bins in Nebraska to go up, for example. And so, you know, they're also, because of the dual distortionary effect of tariffs, we tend not to think that they're very good at raising revenues. I think it's really an interesting research agenda to think about the marginal cost of funds, and specifically in a dynamic framework, to look at you know, how costly are tariffs relative to other revenue mechanisms. And we also have unfortunately we don't have really good tools in trade to deal with these trade deficits and government deficits, as those tend to be sort of macroeconomic issues, which I think we are active in trying to sort of address this and look at deficits in a realistic sort of dynamic forward-looking model. Okay, so one question that Tom always poses is, Tom Rutherford, that is, okay, if these tariffs are so bad, show me at least one model where it matters to me, right? And so in some ways that is, the question is really is a, give me a reasonable model that shows me that these impacts are big. And so to give you a little bit of a tease, this is Trump 2.0. If we use a standard Anderson van Wynkoop gravity model with standard elasticity of substitution of 5, one sector model, and these results are from this this paper I have with Soraya Binti Ali and Christine McDaniel. This is the new paper, Tariff, the Most Beautiful Word in the Dictionary. The estimate from Anderson van Wynkoop is about $100 billion. If we use a standard GTAP and GAMS application, we get about $370 billion. And, that's maybe on the low side of some of the econometric based estimates that use partial equilibrium calculations. But, that's sort of a reasonable number that we would think that we would get out of a CGE model. And, if we go to this bilateral representative firms model that we're proposing in this paper, the damages, the welfare impact sort of skyrockets. I should give you a little bit of an idea of what this scenario is. This is a very simple scenario where we say that the U.S. imposes 60% across the board tariffs on China, 10% tariffs on everyone else, and all countries retaliate symmetrically. So China retaliates with 60% tariff on the U.S., and all other countries retaliate with the 10% tariff on the U.S. Again, I'm not sure it's really that interesting to think about Nash trade wars, and that's because the Nash trade wars are going to depend a lot on the optimal tariff. So structure definitely does matter there because the optimal tariffs are quite different across these structures. But furthermore, I don't think that Nash negotiations are sort of are being debated in the politics. Okay, so we're going to use a high resolution general equilibrium model. We get first order data, of course, from GTAP, and second order data on elasticities. Most of those come from GTAP, except as noted. We're using a very clean environment to do this structural analysis. And I think that's appropriate for structural sensitivity. We want to use, not the most realistic model in the world, but, a simple comparative static framework. And we impose, of course, macroeconomic stability, no change in real net indebtedness, fixed investment, fixed government spending. And so it's a real clean sort of welfare analysis, even though it's a fairly high resolution model. And then in the paper in the GTAP journal, we have this comparison of Armington, Krugman, and the bilateral representative firms representation of trade. Again, the new paper really just looks at Armington and bilateral representative firms, and then we also have this backdrop of the Anderson van Wynkoop one sector model. So just quickly, there are three basic models that we think about trade in the context of doing computational economics. Armington, of course, is the traditional perfect competition model. Krugman is a monopolistic competition model with symmetric firms. And the key there is that in a multi-sector framework, you bring in variety effects on the demand side. And so the Krugman model is completely demand side variety driven. And there's a lot of reasons why that model is, as it's applied in a multi-region framework, is not exactly appropriate. And I'll try to discuss a little bit about that. The Melitz model sort of is the Cadillac of the models because it has these demand side variety effects in a multi-good setting, and it also has these supply side productivity effects. And the productivity effects really come through selection. And that is that there are different varieties on different trade links. In the Krugman model, it's the case that once a good is produced, once a variety is created, let's say it's an alloy that's being produced by a U.S. steel company, then that alloy goes to every country, right? So it's only when trade costs approach infinity that some consumer across the world doesn't consume that good. And so that's sort of an odd feature of the Krugman model as it's applied in a multi-region CGE model. So the question is, why not have a bilateral Krugman model where you have bilateral entry and that replaces the selection effect in the Melitz model? The first reason why not is that you lose convexity if you have a common input to these bilateral firms. And so essentially firms would all enter one market, the most profitable market, and forget about all the other trade markets. And so the way to get around that is you need to have bilateral specific factors. And so that gives the model convexity. And so the idea there is that there's some factors in your economy that are specific to a trade link. Okay, so there's certain factors of production that are specific to U.S.-China trade. And so we could think of it doesn't take very much creativity to think of, what those factors might be. They're pretty sensible, especially in a comparative static framework. And so essentially you have local supply elasticities that indicate the substitutability of other factors with this specific factor. And so that gives you a supply response. And so that essentially replaces the need for a shape parameter in the Melitz framework, from the Melitz framework. And essentially you don't have these inframarginal rents like you have in Melitz. Instead, you have these traditional sort of Ricardian rents on a specific factor that's used only for that trade link. So I apologize for putting a bunch of math up here in the presentation, but I just want to run through quickly the Krugman structure, because again, this bilateral representative firms model is going to be modeled off of a basic Krugman structure. And we're going to see a very slight deviation from the Krugman model. And so essentially we start with this Dixit-Stiglitz price index, where there's this endogenous variable N representing the number of varieties of good I that's produced in region S. Then we can derive the compensated demand for an individual variety. Firms are going to set marginal revenue equals to marginal cost, so they're going to get this standard sort of optimal markup for each bilateral market. And those include the tariff and transport margins. And then we have a free entry condition, which says that the payments to fixed cost equal the accumulated operating profits across all those markets. And then we close out sort of the trade formulation by a market clearance condition for the inputs. And so the supply of the composite input is equal to the number of firms in that region times the fixed cost plus the operating costs. Now, so tau is an iceberg trade cost factor. Again, this model has this feature that once a variety N is produced for one market, it's going to be offered in all markets. That doesn't work very well if we're thinking about doing modeling for developing economies and such, because it suggests that if, say, in the Kehoe critique of the NAFTA studies, Mexico liberalizes trade with the U.S. The U.S. is looking across all of its markets for this free entry, And so there's not going to be a very big variety impact for Mexico, because the variety impact for Mexico is the same as for Japan. And that's because the entry happens at the regional level, not bilaterally. And so, especially in the sort of mid 2000s, when Rutherford and Tarr were doing a lot of work on this, especially the model, the Russian accession model, they were modeling these economies as open economy models. They weren't not necessarily small open economies, but they were open economies. But they had these import links, which had a entry decision. And so, for example, when we were modeling Kenya, we had a region which was Europe or the EU, and that region was not modeled through, as a multi-region model. It was just modeled as, oh, hey, there's an entry decision. And so when demand increases from Kenya, then there's entry of firms into that link. Now, because we weren't modeling the EU internally in that model, you're not really thinking about this as like, oh, this is a bilateral representative firms model. But in fact, when you extend that structure to a multi-region setting, it is. I mean, it is specifically a bilateral representative firms model, because the entry is happening on those specific links. So anyway, that's an odd feature. The other thing that's really odd about the Krugman model is that the mix of factors used in fixed cost is the same as the mix of factors that are used in operating costs. Okay, so this CIS variable is the price of the composite input, and that's the same for operating and for fixed costs. This is clearly a feature for the theorists, because it means that once we substitute the optimal markup condition into the free entry condition, we can show that Q, the quantity produced by an individual firm, is actually a constant. And so we show that in the paper. And we're actually going to leverage that in our model. I'm sort of surprised, I should do it myself. I shouldn't be surprised. I should just do it myself. But it seems like an interesting extension of the Krugman framework or the Mellis framework is to say that, oh, these things have different mixes, and then you get sort of scale effects at the firm level, and firm level output is not a constant. Okay, so let's see. So now let's think about what changes if we go to this bilateral firm representation. Well, first of all, in the price index, we add this subscript R here because entry happens on a bilateral basis. And so the number of firms is going to change depending on which market is being served. Compensated demand doesn't change. The only change here in the optimal markup is that the price of the input, the composite input, is now bilateral. Again, that has to be the case to get convexity in the model, so that we don't have like a knife edge solution where we move all of the resources into one trade link or the other. And so that's going to be dictated by our specific factor, the rents that change as demand changes on an individual link. The free entry condition, again, only changes in the respect that the price of the composite input is bilateral, and that's going to include our transport margins in application and everything. And so then there's a market clearance condition, and so this changes. I'm going to flip back up to the other slide for a second to look at this. So notice that the market clearance condition for the input, which is regional in this case, region S, is across all markets, the sum over R of the operating costs in those markets. And down here, it's individual, right? So there's an individual market clearance condition for each of these bilateral inputs. Okay, so let's move to how this is applied in the model, and these models simplify. These monopolistic competition models simplify quite a bit because of this fixed output per firm feature. So first of all, traditional Armington structure. Anything with a parenthetical dot here means that it's being determined by somewhere else in the general equilibrium. So supply is determined in these four conditions. Demand is being determined in the broader general equilibrium. And so we have market clearance for the absorption of the Armington composite. The price index, which is really zero unit profits on producing the Armington composite. And so that's a traditional CES price index that embeds both the technology and the optimizing behavior of the agents. Then there's a market clearance condition for the bilateral input. So this XIS arm is the bilateral, it's the quantity of the bilateral input. And that's going to equal the demand from the, by applying Shepard's to the zero profit condition. And then we have this condition, which is zero unit profits on producing this composite input. And that's going to include a few components here. First of all, this WIS, that's the regional input. So that's the, think of that as the marginal cost of producing in this nested CES with a materials nest, value-added nest, et cetera. Then adding on that, we have a transport margin, this gamma times tau, that's the transport margin. And then that's a CES composite with ZISR, which is the price of the bilateral specific factor. So essentially by measuring the alphas and the betas, and then you can determine what eta is, the elasticity of substitution, and that gives you a supply elasticity. Now for the runs that I present today, we use the default, which is the supply elasticity is 1. But we do sensitivity analysis on that in the paper. Okay, what does this look like in Krugman? Now, when we make this simplification that the output per firm is fixed, we get this set of equations, which look very familiar. The difference is here is we have an index YIS is going to be an index on output in that sector, in that, and so that gives you the variety effects. And then, of course, that carries through to the demand function. So the price index and the demand functions are different. Now I'm going to BRF. Again, the only difference here is that we have a bilateral index of varieties. Okay, so this X tilde ISR is a bilateral index of varieties. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly move to a set of results.
2 minutes reminder.
Standard GTAP representation here. This is a little bit of an analysis on optimal tariffs. The BRF structure gives us much lower optimal tariffs. I have a paper with Jim Markson that talks about why monopolistic competition gives you lower optimal tariffs than Armington, even though you have the same elasticities. And here's a set of results for an Armington application. This is standard GTAP and GAM stuff. Again, the ultimate scenario here is scenario 6, where we have the 2018 trade war. So the first column here are the results that are presented in the GTAP journal. So that's a replication. And then 6 is with all retaliation and all of the 60% on China and 10% on everybody else. So, pretty sizable losses, especially relative to a standard gravity Anderson Van Wynkoop model. Now let's look at the BRF. The real surprise here is that, in fact, China wins in this case. China always benefits, even in the Armington model, benefits by broadening the trade war, right? Because they're taking advantage of other markets. As the U.S. Imposes tariffs on them, their goods become cheaper in European markets. And as Europe retaliates against the U.S., obviously the links between China and the EU grow. And so we get this sort of interesting result that China actually can have positive welfare gains in this full trade war where the U.S., we call this Fortress U.S. Sort of scenario. Okay, so I'm going to conclude really quickly because I'm out of time, but standard perfect competition models, do indicate that the tariff costs are high at the levels proposed, but they're fighting against this sort of demand side optimal tariff feature of the Armington model. So, we would suggest that bilateral selection can be an important contributor to trade diversion from the supply side. And so this is much more sort of Melitz-esque supply side responses because of selection. And so this really shows that fighting a trade war alone is really costly because you get these supply side trade diversions. In a standard Armington model, the only trade diversion is through the Armington elasticity. And so you don't get that sort of selection effect. Of course, there's variety losses. In the paper, we calculate sort of Feenstra ratios and say that and talk about the variety losses make much more sense in the BRF model relative to Krugman. And so, answering the question, there are some reasonable structures that suggest that the very high tariffs proposed by Trump are in fact really costly. So on the order of $6,700 per annum is what the model suggests. And so that I think that's probably as high of a cost as I've seen without adding on some sort of macroeconomic disruption, which we know is going to happen, but this is just in a straight trade model. And the other thing that comes out of the paper that I have with Christine and Soraya is that Canada and Mexico are in a really bad spot. Mexico not as bad as Canada, but boy, Canada, they get hammered. Okay, I'm going to close it off there because I'm over my time and open it up to discussion. I'm happy to flip back and discuss things. So go for it.
Thank you so much, Ed. This was fantastic. Very interesting results. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to write in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand and ask your question in person. While we wait for some questions, oh, there is one. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
We do.
So thank you very much, Edward, for this super interesting presentation. I was curious, you were mentioning the case of China winning from the war, but I couldn't see it properly, but I think other regions, Europe in particular, were also winning. Could you develop a bit more what is going on there? Because in the end, it turns out that only Canada, Mexico, US lose.
Sure.
I don't know.
Let me yeah. So let me go back and I'll
Thank you.
Let's take a look at those slides. So the first one is this at the top here. This is just copied straight out of the paper that's in the Journal of Global Economic Analysis. This is the base.
Ed? Sorry, a bit larger, please.
Sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
Hold on one second.
Yes.
Here, let me do it this way. This is better. This I can blow up.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Now I can just blow this up. Okay, so this is the 2018 trade war. Can you see that?
Yes, much better.
And so, although there were the steel and aluminum tariffs, most of the trade war really involved the U.S. and China. And so, in the if you look at just the Armington, right, you see that there's these adverse impacts on China and the U.S., but Europe in particular gains. And I think that's a standard result. You just have trade diversion, right? That you have two big trade partners that are engaged in a war, and that means that U.S. goods are getting cheaper, China's goods are getting cheaper for Europe, and there's demand side trade diversion that the U.S. is purchasing more EU goods and China is producing more EU goods, and so that's sort of a standard result. Now, if we go back to the BRF results, or sorry, the Trump 2.0 results, we definitely see that pattern, but I think everything here sort of makes sense. That again, this is the 40 billion. Let's see if I can. That one there is the 40 billion from the other paper that I was showing you graphically. Mm-hmm. If the U.S. imposes a 60% tariff on China, again, there's big gains for the EU. And they get bigger if the U.S. and China just engages in a trade war, right? So this is 60% tariffs between the U.S. and China, and everybody else stays the same. Now, of course, the gains go down when the U.S. imposes a 10% tariff on the EU and everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. But again, that 10% is broad-based, and so there's not a specific negative impact on the EU. What dominates, of course, are the impacts of the U.S.-China trade war. They dominate the 10% tariff on the EU, and as the EU imposes a 10% tariff on everybody else, you're getting even bigger. Sorry, when everybody else imposes a 10% tariff on the U.S., you get an even bigger gain for the EU. So basically, everybody gains from this U.S. unilateral action, except for the U.S. and Canada. But it does tell you that coordinated retaliation really works, right? That if the world gets together and basically retaliates against this rogue country, the U.S., that in fact, all of the costs are being borne by the U.S. Now, let's look at just the sum of the welfare impacts and see if they make sense. And they definitely make sense, right? That as you increase the distortions in the world economy, the welfare costs go up. But in this fortress U.S. scenario here, right? You know, the U.S. definitely bears way more than 100% of the costs. And again, that comes down to the fact that the optimal tariff for the U.S. in this situation is pretty low, right? So, rolling up, let's see, how do I turn off this? So relative to a standard Armington model, we've got optimal tariffs in the range of 6% instead of 11%. And so the results are mitigated, even though the pattern is pretty close for the Armington model, the results are mitigated in the Armington model. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. So you are suggesting what, for example, the IMF is suggesting not to do, that we shouldn't retaliate the rest of countries in a way. The losers would be US and Canada, but other countries would benefit, right?
Yeah, so I think coordinated retaliation is always something that makes sense, right? You know, the original excuse for the 2018 trade war was that there were intellectual property issues with China, and nobody sort of denies that. But obviously, the way to fix that is that you need a coordinated response, essentially through the WTO, to go after China. If the U.S. does it alone, then you're really benefiting other trade partners through trade diversion. And so, if you're going to retaliate, if you're going to engage in a trade war, you want to have as many allies as you can, right? And this is what's really strategically problematic with the U.S. policy, is that, if you go it alone, and you get into an actual trade war where there's retaliation, it's going to be costly.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Maria. There are some more questions. I think Angel asked a little bit earlier in the chat box, and we'll first do that, and then Maxim, and then to Dominic.
Okay.
So Angel asks, the non-perfect competition assumption applies to all or selected sectors in all or selected countries. Is there scope for hybrid application of these assumptions?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so I actually have a slide on that, and the answer is no, it doesn't apply for all sectors. So I went through that really quickly. Let me just share once more. So 28 of the 57 sectors, we're using GTAP 11, but we went back to the GTAP 10 commodities because all of our reports were built around that. So, you know, but 28 of the manufacturing and business service sectors are modeled as imperfectly competitive. And so all the other sectors are Armington, and they use the GTAP elasticities. I will note that we use a pretty low elasticity of substitution for the IRTS sectors, and that's to give us variety effects, sizable variety effects. You know, we wanted a single parameter that we could do sensitivity analysis on, and that's why we chose that. Again, we're really interested in the structural sensitivity, not sort of doing a forecast. And so that's an excuse for using that single parameter across all the CRTS goods. Is there anything else on this slide that's sort of material? So we did have to manipulate the accounts, obviously, to give us this bilateral specific factor, and then it enters this nest at the top level. And again, we calibrate. There's quite a bit of discussion now in the paper on calibrating the supply response. Okay.
Thank you. Maxim.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Very interesting presentation and also the paper. So obviously, you know, assumptions on trade representation mechanics do matter, and quite a bit, as you have shown here. And not only at macro level, right? In the paper, you also look into prices by different sectors, how they change. So there are quite kind of sizable differences there. What I was wondering about is whether you have thought about or maybe try conducting any type of validation exercise or backcasting exercise, trying to understand which of these assumptions kind of fits better actual observed impacts, either maybe through their 2017, 2018 kind of trade frictions, or maybe using this more up-to-date round, or if you have any thoughts in general in this regard. Thank you.
Yeah, so we haven't done any explicit validation stuff, but we have the Fajlbaum et al. Sort of econometric analysis of the trade war. And looking at the macro side, they don't look too far off. And we do review that in the beautiful tariff paper. Essentially, if you take their model is just it's basically summing across markets. So it's a partial equilibrium approach, econometric approach. But they did look at the real price changes and the real sort of essentially welfare triangles associated with those individual markets. And they do it at a very detailed level, HS6. So when I look at those results, if I said, okay, those are the sort of base CRTS results, and then you incorporate, sort of, we know that they're bigger because of variety impacts, then I would say that we're not too far off at all. I forget the exact numbers, but if you look at the beautiful tariff paper, I give you sort of that basic argument. And so that would be sort of the closest thing that we've done to sort of real validation. Yeah, COVID happened. It's pretty hard, right? So I would love somebody to do a validation. There's good methods for doing validation, and so it's just really hard, and especially in a model that's designed like this that has very few real world features, right? I mean, it's not sort of meant to be a forecast. It's really meant to be a sandbox in order to do this structural sensitivity analysis. So,
Thanks, Ed and Maxim. Dominic, go ahead.
Thanks, Ed. Really interesting stuff. I have two questions. So one deals with, what kind of information do you need to actually calibrate, your fixed costs and any other of the important parameters in this specification? And the second question, I think, has to do with the Armington elasticities. As I recall, Peter and Maureen, when they discussed the Melitz model and they compared it with Armington, they argued somewhat forcefully that you need to adjust the elasticities for the Melitz model, and when you do that, you get virtually the same welfare results in both models. So the question there is, are the Armington elasticities appropriate for your BRF version?
yeah, so let me just, the first one, as far as the fixed cost calibrations and stuff, you don't really have a degree of freedom. Once you have the elasticity, the markup is fixed, right? There's no, you have to calibrate what the fixed costs are. If you're looking at an equilibrium where the fixed costs are being allocated, you don't have a degree of freedom. So the fixed cost calibration is really like, it's a red herring. There are important parameters though, which are the elasticity, right?
Yeah.
And the elasticity of supply is a new parameter in this model. In the Melitz model, of course, you have the elasticity of substitution, which is the demand side variety parameter. And then you have the shape parameter of the Pareto distribution. And so we have the same sort of empirical problem here, is that for each sector, we need an elasticity of substitution, and we need an elasticity of supply to calibrate the response of other factors substituting for the specific factor. And so that, there is a calibration challenge there for sure. As far as the adjustments in the elasticities, this ACR equivalence, which is what Peter and Maureen build their equivalents out of. I mean, I think, I don't find that compelling at all. The ACR equivalence goes completely away once you get into a multi-good setting where you don't have symmetric varieties. And so, although in the one sector model, there's a closed form solution that you can say, look, the Armington model is equivalent to the Melitz model or the Krugman model. If you make the appropriate adjustment in the shape parameter in the Melitz model, and you make the appropriate adjustment in the elasticity substitution in the Krugman model, then those models are completely isomorphic. But this is an environment that's not very interesting, right? It's an environment in which trade makes no impact on the redistribution of resources within your economy. And so, I think, we use this estimate from Bernard Jensen, Cordum. I forget what, but anyway, we use this estimate of 3.8, which is really based on looking at firm level data and sort of, trying to get it at the sort of firm level substitution elasticity, not necessarily sort of the gravity estimate. And so that, that gives us bigger variety impacts. If you use, anything above an elasticity of substitution of like 6 or 7, there's no use doing IRTS, right? Because the markups are so small, there's really very few variety impacts. So, yes, we use a low elasticity from the literature that, gives us the variety impacts that we're looking for. So,
Can I, yeah, can I
by
push
design.
on the first part? You know, playing devil's advocate, let's say you had to go and testify on Capitol Hill, you know, and you're going to have people that are talking about the plausibility of your fixed costs, for example. You say that they're part of the calibration process, but do they make economic sense? Or can you know, can you validate them with actual data?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the first thing that I would critique this calibration exercise on first is that, we know that the composition of inputs for the fixed costs are not the same as the composition of inputs for the operating costs.
Absolutely.
And that
Yeah.
opens up a whole sort of can of worms, because now you have scale effects at the firm level. There are rationalization gains or losses from trade. And so that's going to be way more important than sort of the allocation of the proportion of revenues that goes towards the fixed costs. But of course, once you go down that rabbit hole, you should go all the way, and you need to sort of, go out and measure fixed costs. And first of all, that complicates the model and, blows up the dimensions. So you have to have the full you have to be measuring the firm level rationalization gains on top of it. So it's not a very parsimonious environment. And yeah, it's nice to have only two parameters that matter, but of course we know that many more matter, right?
Thanks, Ed.
Yep.
Thanks, Dominique. I actually wanted to follow up with Dominique's points, and waiting for other comments or questions. So that is exactly what we also have in the GTAP firm heterogeneity model. The scale effects and the fixed costs and variable costs are differentiated. So that adds to the computational complexities of these full-scale applications. But I wanted to ask you about, so you position this BRF model as representative firms as opposed to average firms, and you don't have explicit productivity heterogeneity in the model. It's implicit and captured by these firm entry and exit mechanisms. And I was wondering if first, if you had a full-scale balance model that is computationally tractable and applicable, do you think that would yield even larger welfare losses to the BRF results due to selection and productivity effects and scale effects, maybe offsetting each other or stimulating each other? And the second question is about the elasticities and shape parameters. So in a previous work that we did, we assumed productivity heterogeneity following Pareto distribution and firm size and firm productivity. And then we imputed the elasticity of substitution and shape parameter that are compatible with the firm heterogeneity environment. And they are much lower than the Armington elasticities and the shape parameters that are found in the literature for GTAP manufacturing sectors split. And we found that when we compared it with log normal distribution and other distribution, in some of the manufacturing sectors like petroleum products or mineral products and textiles, that monopolistic competition with heterogeneous firms are not a good fit with productivity heterogeneity following Pareto laws. So the second question is, do you have any guiding criteria or empirical diagnostics to choose which sectors would be more applicable with these BRF framework? Is there a guideline that you've thought of? Thanks.
Sure. So your first question, that's really the million-dollar question, right? Is how does this compare to a full-blown Melitz structure? And unfortunately, we can't do that computationally. And we've been sort of threatening to do some toy models to explore that question. My intuition is that, taking your question, my intuition is that we could adjust both the supply elasticity and the substitution elasticity among varieties such that we match a set of given parameters in the Melitz structure. So Dave Tar and I do this in our earlier paper in the GTAP journal, which looks at, this is mathematics of the Armington-Krugman-Mellis models with detailed derivations. We do this, we basically match the average trade response by adjusting the parameters across the different structures. And so that gives us something that gets at, I think, Dominique's critique that, well, we're not adjusting the elasticities when we're doing the structural sensitivity. So, you can do that, and you would be able to do that in this framework also, where you adjust those elasticities such that you get, something close to the same trade responses. In a CGE framework, you're not going to get exactly the same responses, but you can get something close. The second question, we tend not to, first of all, trust the standard sort of gravity elasticities. So in the gravity literature, because they're thinking about gravity from this one sector or separable sectors perspective, they're in this world in which there is equivalence between Krugman and Armington. And so they interpret those as the same parameter. And in a world in which you have resources moving between sectors, I would say that's just wrong. That what you're getting is not the variety the Dixit-Stiglitz variety parameter when you do gravity estimation. And so we do use a lower elasticity in those IRTS sectors. The question of selection, I would say, if you have a good estimate, the way that you select is if you're going to be using elasticities in the model and the elasticity is below 5, why bother IRTS? Okay, so the selection is really about, do I have a good estimate of the firm level elasticity of substitution? If I do, and that's high, then we know that that this monopolistic competition stuff can't really matter that much to the overall results. And so that's generally what I do is I think about, well, if I'm going to be using the off-the-shelf GTAP elasticities, I may trim down the number of IRTS manufacturing goods to only include the ones with low elasticities of substitution.
Okay. Thanks so much, Ed. I think it's almost time, so I'd like to wrap up. Thank you so much. What a great discussion this has been. And on behalf of everyone, I'd like to sincerely thank Edward Balistreri for sharing this important research with us and for stimulating this rich discussion. And I'd like to also thank everybody who participated and attended and asked questions. Thanks so much for your engagement. This session has been a powerful reminder of that structural assumption in model design matters for trade policy analysis. And let's keep thinking about these alternative structures and keep working on it. And thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next seminar.